Hello, everyone. I'm Donald Robertson, and I'm here today with my friend Massimo Pigliucci, and we're going to be talking about how to be a happy skeptic. Hi, Massimo. It's good to see you again.
Nice seeing you. Thanks for having me.
So, you've written yet another book. How many books have you
I
written now?
know.
Can you remember?
Actually, I think this is number 18 or something like that.
Wow,
I could be
really?
wrong.
18. You lose count after a while.
Yeah,
Like,
but it includes also the technical books on my first part of my career. So there's a lot of stuff there that probably a few people have read.
so, why did you choose to write this one? I should say the subtitle is How to Be a Happy Skeptic, The Power of Doubt in a Meaningful Life, and Lessons from Cicero's Philosophy. So, we're going to be talking a little bit about Cicero in particular. Why this book? What drew you to the idea? Why did you choose to write it now?
I think fundamentally three things, really. On the one hand, I've always been interested in skepticism in the modern sense of scientific skepticism. So this is, an approach to the study of the difference between science and pseudoscience. And my first career was as an evolutionary biologist, and I run into what is called the demarcation problem, the distinction between science and pseudoscience, a lot in that area. So I've always been interested in scientific skepticism, which is in fact connected to the notions from ancient skepticism. That was reason number one. Reason number two is that I've always been fascinated with the figure of Marcus Julius Cicero, who was arguably the first ancient Roman philosopher and one of the most influential thinkers in the Western tradition. I mean, he has never stopped being influential. He was well known to the early Christian fathers, discussed and read during the Middle Ages. He was the major figure of the Renaissance. The Renaissance more or less started when the Italian poet Petrarch rediscovered Cicero's letters. It was very well known and discussed during the Enlightenment, and then it had a major influence on the founding fathers of the American Revolution. So this is somebody who has had literally never been away for 2,000 years. So that's a fascinating figure right there. Also, when I was in high school back in Italy, I translated Cicero from Latin, and so and it's a beautiful Latin. It's a really
Oh,
uh, incredible writer. So that's two reasons. The third reason has to do with Stoicism. As you know, I do consider myself a practitioner of Stoicism, and I try to do my best. But I'm occasionally disturbed by the fact that there's a little bit of sort of strong ideological positions within modern Stoicism, and people that say, "Oh, yeah, unless you believe this or that or the other, you're not really a Stoic," that sort of stuff. And I was fascinated by Cicero because he really was very favorable to Stoicism. He was not a Stoic himself, but he was very, very much Stoic adjacent, so to speak. And so he took the best of what he could find in other philosophies, primarily Stoicism, but then he also kept for himself the option of saying, you know what, this may be incorrect. I could be wrong about this, and if that's the case, then let's discuss it. So I these three reasons put together at some point told me that it's time to write that kind of book.
he may have known more about Stoicism than some of the Stoics. Like,
That's right.
he's one of our most important sources. And a lot of people that are interested in Stoicism today, I mean, I do remember a time where I think everybody I met that was into Stoicism had at least read Marcus Aurelius. And although recently I think that's no longer true. And, I
Hmm.
meet more people now who have never read any of the classics, but the Stoicism they're into, I think, has come solely from podcasts and blogs and things like that.
Interesting.
But not that many people have necessarily read what Cicero says about Stoicism, despite the fact that it's one of our major sources for understanding what the Stoics believed. But as you said, he wasn't a Stoic. He was into Stoicism. He maybe assimilated parts of it. He's very well educated in it. But he was more aligned with the academic school. The school was originally founded by Plato. Um,
Right.
and was influenced to some extent by the skeptical tradition. So, do you want to say a little bit about what we mean by skepticism here? And who were these guys? Who were the skeptics? Introduce them to us.
Yeah, so the modern term of the word, the modern meaning of the word skepticism is, of course, usually derogatory, right? A skeptic is somebody who doesn't believe anything. It's like dismissing of things. In fact, I noticed over
Yeah,
time that all of the major Greco-Roman schools have their names kind of turned
yeah.
into something different, right? A Stoic is now somebody with a stiff upper lip and who suppresses emotion, which, of course, as you know, is not what the actual Stoics thought. An Epicurean is somebody who is into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which is definitely not what Epicurus was about. A Cynic is somebody who's, again, it's very negative about things, and that's not Diogenes of Sinope for sure. And the same goes for the skeptics. So the original word skeptikos in Greek really means inquirer. So a skeptic is somebody who is supposed to keep an open mind and keep searching for the truth. Now, as you say, Cicero considered himself a member of the Skeptic Academy. The academy, of course, was founded by Plato, although Plato was long dead by the time Cicero was alive. The academy went through a number of phases during its long history. It lasted almost a millennium, in fact, between Plato and the closing of all the schools during the times of the Byzantine emperors. One of those phases was the skeptic phase. And in that sense, some of the members of the academy thought, look, we need to go back to the roots. We need to go back to the fundamentals. And what are these fundamentals? It's Socrates. And Socrates was arguably, at least that's one way to present Socrates, he was a skeptic, meaning that he claimed not to know anything. He claimed that he was inquiring into things. He was asking questions, right, open to answers. And so that is the definition of a skeptic in the sense of the academy.
I was going to ask you, how skeptical is Socrates? He's a little bit more of a complicated
He
case.
certainly is.
He definitely
He certainly
sometimes
is.
says he knows things.
Yes. I think that too often Socrates is presented as the kind of guy that, as I just said, only asks questions and doesn't open-ended question, doesn't know where he's going. I think he actually knew quite a bit more than people give him credit where he was going with some of those questions. Nevertheless, the attitude that he embodies clearly is one of open-ended inquiry. So there is that. However, there was already a school of skepticism out there. By the time skepticism sort of hit the academy, there were the Pyrrhonists, so named after Pyrrho of Elis, who is a very mysterious figure. We don't really know much about him. In fact, a lot of what we know about Pyrrhonism is actually a later creation of a guy named Sextus Empiricus, way after Cicero. But Pyrrho was an interesting character. He lived at the time of Alexander the Great. In fact, he accompanied Alexander during his expedition to India, where Pyrrho came in contact with some mysterious figures that the Greeks refer to as the gymnosophists, literally the naked wise men. We don't know who these people were, possibly Hinduists or Jainists or something like that. People have even suggested that there is a connection with early Buddhism, although that's hard to establish because Buddhism was around by that time, but it was an entirely oral tradition. We don't have the first written texts in Buddhism date from several centuries later, so who knows what was going on at the time. Anyway, Pyrrho comes back and then sort of starts teaching this thing that we now call skepticism, and in the ancient world actually was referred to as Pyrrhonism. Now, there is a difference, however, between Pyrrhonism and the academic skeptic. Academic skepticism evolved over a number of decades and over a number of different scholars who were in charge of the academy at the time. It initially looked a lot like Pyrrhonism. It was pretty much impossible to tell it apart. And that is because the first of the scholars of the academy who turned to skepticism, Arcesilaus, was in fact probably a friend or a student of of Pyrrho. So there is in fact a direct connection between the two. Now, the Pyrrhonists, let me talk briefly about them, although the book is really not about them. It's about the academic skeptics, but we need to understand the other branch in order to make sense of the whole thing. So the Pyrrhonists basically divided everything in life into two things that are evident and things that are not evident. And they said, when it comes to the things that are not evident, which includes a lot of stuff, it includes questions of metaphysics, question of ethics, even questions on what we would today call science. The only reasonable thing to do is to suspend judgment. Why? Well, because you can present a very strong opinion about, let's say, the existence of God, and then you can also present a very strong opinion about the non-existence of God. You can mount a very good argument about the fact that virtue should be the only good in life, and then you can build a very good argument to the opposite. So, given that, the Pyrrhonists said, why don't we just engage into epoche, suspension of judgment? And that way, we're not going to be disturbed. We're not going to be. They noticed, which is interesting because it is still true today, that people attach themselves personally to certain opinions, right? And certain opinions start to define a person, and therefore, if you question that opinion, then it feels like a personal attack, and so people are really disturbed by this kind of thing. So the Pyrrhonists thought, forget about all that, since there is no way to really tell one way or the other. Why don't you suspend judgment and then enjoy the resulting likely degree of ataraxia, of tranquility of mind? Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the Pyrrhonists did not have ways to navigate the world, basically. I mean, they had to make decisions. They had to, if I'm hungry, I still have to eat, even though I am a Pyrrhonist. I can't suspend judgment on that. Otherwise, I'm going to starve to death, right?
Yeah.
But those they called the evident things. And the evident things are the ones where you can just follow basic sort of common sense approaches, right? If you are in a certain society, live in a certain society, you follow the customs of that society. If you're listening to your body, so if you're hungry, you eat. If you're thirsty, you drink, and so on. Right? You rely at least in a superficial way or in a provisional way, let's say, on your senses. If I see you on the screen, well, that's probably you. Yes, it could be your doppelganger or your evil twin or something like that, but not likely. It's probably you because I'm seeing you, right? And then finally, the fourth way by which they navigate life was by asking people who know. So if I want to learn a particular trade, or let's say to play a musical instrument, then I just go to whoever is good at that sort of stuff. Okay, great. That's not a very exciting philosophy, however, because it turns out to be essentially a combination of two things. You use basic common sense for most of your stuff in life, and then you set aside all of the interesting questions. You just don't even think about it that much about stuff such as metaphysics, science, and ethics. That's not very exciting. So the academic skeptics went a different way.
In some ways, it doesn't sound that skeptical either. Like, I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity about exactly what they meant, but it sounds kind of conservative in some respects. Like, go and speak to experts. Like trust your body.
It does. I mean,
follow customs and stuff like that.
Right. Imagine you're living in a society where one of the customs is slavery. Well, as a Pyrrhonist, you'd say, all right, fine. I don't have any reason to go against it. I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Especially if you're not a slave.
Yeah. So it's kind of tricky concept. It's interesting. So those are the Pyrrhonists, but then what happened to skepticism?
Then what happened is that during the skeptical phase of the academy, things, people started getting a little bit more sophisticated and moving beyond Pyrrhonism, up until the point in which we get to arguably the major skeptic of antiquity, certainly in the academic tradition, and that would be Carneades. Carneades was famous for a number of reasons, and let me tell you just two. At one point, he was sent to a diplomatic mission to Rome from Athens. Athens had to pay a fine at some point because they'd done something that went against the Roman interests. And so they sent, interestingly, 3 philosophers to Rome to plead their case with the Senate. One of them was Carneades, the academic skeptic, and then there was a Stoic, actually, Diogenes of Babylon, and then there was a Aristotelian, a peripatetic. So these 3 went to Rome and argued their case in front of the Senate. But then in the afternoon, they had free time. And Cicero, in fact, tells the story in some detail. And so what they did was they started lecturing about philosophy, which was important because that was the first time that a Roman audience was exposed to philosophy. So a lot of young people went to see these lectures, and Carneades gave 2 lectures back to back on one day and then the following day. In one lecture, he defended the notion of justice, and in the other lecture, he said, justice, forget that. It's all relative. We don't know what justice is, and there is no justice and that sort of stuff. The Romans were not pleased, especially the conservative Romans were not pleased in the Senate. Apparently, that did not affect the outcome of the mission because the fine was in fact reduced, and then eventually Athens did not pay it at all. But that was one of the things that catapulted Carneades to prominence. Another important thing that Carneades did was to engage, I guess, posthumously with Chrysippus, the big Stoic, right? The third head of the Stoa, the one that Diogenes Laertius famously tells us in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers that without Chrysippus there would be no Stoa, meaning that his contributions to Stoicism were so fundamental. Well, apparently Carneades had some beef to pick with Chrysippus, especially when it came to epistemology, that is, to theory of knowledge. And he spent so much time of his career doing that he said out of himself that without Chrysippus there would be no Carneades. So he was really into this kind of discussion. Now, what was the discussion about? The Stoics argued that at least the sage, the ideal reasoner, is capable of perfect knowledge, of true knowledge, right? There are certain kinds of impressions, according to the Stoics, which they call cataleptic, as in grabbing impressions, that we all have, but we may be mistaken about it, even about cataleptic impressions, but the sage is not mistaken. The sage can tell the difference. There is a mark of truth, basically, in the impression. And so the sage, at least when it comes to cataleptic impression, cannot be wrong. And the skeptic said, I don't think so. That's just not a thing. There is no mark or truth in things themselves. The world doesn't come with labels of true or not true. What we can do, the best that we can do, is to pay attention to our senses and reason as well as we can. Those are the only 2 sources of knowledge that we have, the senses and reason. The problem is, argued Carneades, both of those 2 sources we know are fallible. We can be mistaken about what we see, what we hear, what we touch, and we can be mistaken about what we think. If that's the case, since even the sage is just a human being, is not a supernatural being, is not a god, then the sage also can be mistaken. And so this discussion went on for literally decades, back and forth. In fact, our friend and colleague John Sellers actually has a whole portion of one of his books that is devoted to the development of this discussion. Now, why is all of this interesting? Because in so doing, Carneades developed an interesting system of reasoning that was he was looking for a criterion to be able to tell whether a particular impression was, true or not, or, good or not, reliable or not, that sort of stuff. So he came up with this idea. So why don't we use something called the pitanon? The pitanon is just literally in Greek means convincing or, likely or something like that. So he said the best we can do is actually to attach different degrees of convincingness to our impressions. There are some impressions that we're not going to bet a lot of money on it. So for instance, if I have the impression that, let's say tonight, I'm in Turin right now, it's still the middle of the afternoon, but let's say tonight I have the impression that the number of stars in the sky is odd instead of even. Yeah, I'm not going to put a lot of stake into it. It has a low degree of pitanon, right? But there are other impressions that I'm much more confident about, like the one that I'm talking to you using a tablet in an office that I'm borrowing from a colleague and so on and so forth. That's pretty strong. I mean, it will take a lot to convince me that this is not actually happening. I could be hallucinating. I could have a high fever and therefore be mistaken about what's happening. But, that's not very likely. And then there are other things, Carneades said, that are so convincing, that are so thoroughly explored, that have been so well researched that it's really, really difficult to doubt them. And then on those things, you're going to bet a lot. Now, all of this Cicero looks at it, translates it into Latin, because one of his missions was to bring philosophy to the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And Latin was at the time a more simple and straightforward and practical language than Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of terms just simply did not exist. When Cicero translates Pitanon, he has what turned out to be a stroke of genius, because he translates it with the word probabilis,
Yeah.
from which our word probability comes. And that actually is a good way to understand what the academic skeptics were doing. I'm not suggesting that, they were talking about probabilities. I'm not suggesting that they actually articulated a fully quantitative view of, probability theory. That's definitely not the case. We have to wait until, the 18th century with Thomas Bayes for that to actually happen. But they did anticipate this notion that impressions come with different degrees of reliability, and therefore there's kind of a continuum of reliability, and that it is incumbent on us to classify, to arrive at a judgment of what degree of reliability do I attach to this particular impression. And then depending on that, that becomes a guide for action. If my impression doesn't seem to be very reliable, then I'm not going to invest a lot of time or energy or whatever. I'm not going to bet a lot on it. But if it has very high degree of reliability or probability, as Cicero put it, then I'm going to act differently. So that is the crucial sort of invention in terms of epistemology. Essentially, the academic skeptics' epistemology was fallibilist. That is, they said from the get-go, look, we could be wrong. And it was probabilist. It was based on different degrees of probability. Modern epistemology, the dominant version of modern epistemology, is in fact fallibilist and probabilistic. So they anticipated modern epistemology by a couple of millennia.
I think in modern Greek, piθανό can mean possible or likely.
Mm-hmm.
So it's come to mean
that's right.
something,
which makes sense. Yeah,
kind of similar.
it makes sense. It's similar. Yeah.
So I wonder if it's worth digging a little bit deeper into what do you feel the relationship is between Cicero's philosophy and Stoicism. Then Cicero's more inclined towards a kind of eclectic version of the academy and some skepticism and epistemology. Like, how does his philosophy in general relate to Stoicism?
So it does say it, explicitly in more than one of his works, for instance, in De Officiis on duties and in Academica on the academy, that he considers himself an academic skeptic. And in fact, he explains immediately what that means. He says, that means that if I am wrong, I'm happy to be corrected. Right? If you show me with good arguments or evidence that I am wrong, great. I never said that I was that I had the truth with the capital T, so I'm happy to be correct. However, a lot of his philosophy was a mix of, you use the word eclectic here, a mix of Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Stoicism. With a very, very strong leaning toward the Stoics. A lot. One can argue that pretty much all of Cicero's ethics comes from the Stoics. And in fact, he says so himself in more than one place. I just mentioned De Officiis on duties. That book, he tells us at the beginning, he wrote it because the topic of the book is how to be a good statesman. In general, how to be a good citizen and how to behave properly in a polis, but specifically how to be a good statesman. Which was a very high interest to Cicero because he himself was a statesman, right? At some point, he became consul, which was the highest political office in Republican Rome. Now, he says at the beginning of On Duties that he writes this book because he was inspired by a book on a similar topic by the Middle Stoic Panaetius. Of course, he doesn't use the word Middle Stoic. That's a modern invention. But Panaetius of Rhodes was one of what we today call the Middle Stoics. We do not have a lot from the Middle Stoics, unfortunately. There's only fragments survive. But Cicero had read Panaetius, specifically this book on duties that it's lost. And also, he was actually a student in his youth. Cicero was a student of Posidonius, the other big middle Stoic. So he had firsthand experience of Stoicism as it was taught at the time when he was alive, when we would today call, as I said, Middle Stoicism. So he writes On Duties, And he tells us immediately, this is Stoicism. This is essentially Stoicism in action. Very often I hear today, for instance, that the Stoics have nothing to say about, let's say, political philosophy. But that's not quite true. The fact is, we lost a lot of the writings of the early Stoics, but Cicero has maintained and transmitted to us some of that knowledge, some of that philosophy, because he has written stuff that is about not only ethics at a personal level, but also political philosophy in general, and it does reflect essentially Stoic thinking. So there is a very clear connection there. Now, that said, however, Cicero can also be significantly critical of the Stoics. He writes a whole book called De Divinatione, on divination, where he blasts the Stoics for believing in divination, for accepting things like astrology and the flight of birds and the entrails of organs. Now, the Stoics were not crazy. The reason they believed in divination is because in their physics, in their metaphysics, everything is connected by cause and effect to everything else. And so it stands to reason that if you look at one aspect of the web of cause and effect, you might be able to infer another aspect of the web of cause and effect. This is, in fact, the way modern science works. It's just that we don't look at the entrails of animals or the flight of birds, because we realize that the connection there is very, very loose. So it would take a lot of reconstructing. But Cicero is critical of this aspect of Stoic philosophy, of Stoic metaphysics, and he has no compulsion, blasting the Stoics. So he retains an intellectual independence. He criticizes people where he thinks they need criticizing, but he also very much endorses ideas that to him sound good and reasonable, and more importantly, useful when that is the case.
I wondered, because my kind of background's in therapy, if we could talk about the therapeutic dimension of it, because Stoicism has a connection with cognitive behavioral therapy, but ancient Greek skepticism, I think, has quite a lot of explicitly therapeutic aspects to it. And I think actually, out of all of the ancient schools of philosophy, in some ways, it perhaps has more potential than others. Like, this might shock and horrify some Epicureans out there, but I actually think Greek skepticism holds more promise in terms of modern cognitive psychology and therapy than Epicureanism would. That really stands out to me quite a lot, actually. So I wondered, let's start off with
what
an
are you
easy
thinking?
question.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just go the whole way and annoy the Epicureans then. All right. So, because Epicureanism places too much value on subjective feelings, basically. And we know that actually a lot of people that study philosophy don't realize this, but there's a lot of converging research today in psychotherapy and the psychology of emotions that shows that can be counterproductive. So in particular, strongly disvaluing anxiety or pain and viewing avoidance of those feelings as a priority is known as experiential avoidance in the research literature, and it's correlated with poorer emotional resilience. But also placing too much effort on trying to control or maintain subjective feelings of pleasure is known to be counterproductive as well. So these things are better seen as a kind of consequence of changing our thinking and our behavior in a healthy direction, rather than something that we put too much emphasis on and pursue too directly.
Right.
So the Epicureans think they're kind of going straight for the goal of life in that regard, but that directness might actually be counterproductive in a number of ways psychologically. And the benefit I see in skepticism is that there's a couple of themes we could pick out, and I'll just mention them in passing because I want you to speak to this a little bit more. But we mentioned before we came on air, there's a research tool called a questionnaire that measures intolerance of uncertainty, including ambiguity. And there's quite a lot of research now that demonstrates that people with generalized anxiety disorder are highly intolerant of uncertainty. They're always searching for solutions and searching for answers, even in areas where that's impossible and they're kind of beating themselves over the head. People with OCD and clinical depression also score high on intolerance of
Sure.
uncertainty. And we also know it's trainable. So you can teach people to increase their tolerance of uncertainty and ambiguity in life. And when you do that, they develop greater emotional resilience. So that seems to me indirectly the skeptical epoche, like, and some of the argumentative practices that you mentioned with Carneades would require higher tolerance of uncertainty and ambiguity than normal. So it might be conducive to better mental health. There's also a characteristic that we call cognitive flexibility, which is the
Mhm.
capacity that someone has to view a situation or a problem from more than one perspective and to kind of think outside of the box, as it were. So I see Socrates as being like a poster boy for cognitive flexibility. Like
Right.
I think it's a fairly safe bet. He had a very high level of cognitive flexibility. And we know that that also tends to be associated with better mental health. So from a very cognitive perspective, as it were, I think there's some reasons to wonder whether the skeptics could potentially have been onto something. So I wonder how you feel suspending judgment or embracing skepticism has the potential to help us. Could
Right.
it be therapeutic?
So I think you're right. The evidence does show that those connections are there, and the ancient skeptics, both the Pyrrhonists actually and the academic skeptics, had that kind of intuition, right? When the Pyrrhonists said, just let go of these strong opinions, this attachment to these strong opinions, and you would likely, that was an interesting, nice twist. You would likely develop ataraxia. That is an empirical question, of course. You can't just say that. It's not a logical conclusion from an a priori argument, right? It is an empirical one. But one of the reasons we value so much still today what the Greco-Romans did in this area, not just the Stoics, but many of the Greco-Roman philosophies, is because they were very good observers of human nature. They were paying attention to the behavior of people and to how people reacted to things. That's why they were able to anticipate a lot of stuff that we still try to study systematically and quantitatively today by means of modern science. And we're still, in some sense, kind of catching up with what the insights were. Now, the Stoics the skeptics in this particular case, the Pyrrhonists, in fact, they developed some techniques to actually do this, right? Because the part of the question here is, well, okay, but how do I suspend judgment? It's not like I can just talk myself into it, can I? And the answer is, well, actually, you can, but you have to do it in certain ways. So the Pyrrhonists came up with a number of what they call modes for reminding yourself that you do not, in fact, have access to absolute truths, and therefore to nudge yourself toward, as you put it a minute ago, toward being more comfortable with indecision, more comfortable with not knowing things, more comfortable with a state of inquiry as opposed to a final state of some sort. Now, there are two lists of these modes. One is very, very long, and I never remember all the entries. It's 20 modes of anidesimus. But then later on, another Pyrrhonist, Agrippa, came up with a shorter version of 5 modes. And these are actually very interesting for a couple of reasons. So if you don't mind, let's go briefly through them.
Yeah.
So I divide them into 2 groups. There's 2 modes, and then there is another 3, and there's a reason for that, and that I'll explain in a moment. So remember, the goal of these modes is to nudge yourself toward more skepticism, toward suspension of judgment, toward not being so sure of what you think you know, right? So one mode is sometimes referred to as dissent. That is, you remind yourself that, people have different opinions about this stuff. Whatever the stuff is, smart people, not just anybody, but even
Yeah.
smart people that have studied this stuff, they have different opinions. And if that is the case, then why am I so sure that I got the right opinion, particularly if I'm not an expert about a particular
Now,
situation? So
can I
that's
just
dissent.
interject briefly
Yeah,
in
of
response to
course.
some of them? Like that line of questioning we also find in some of the Socratic dialogues, and it's very prominent in modern cognitive therapy as well. And it potentially plays quite an
Yes.
important role. But maybe there's the one thing that might emerge from our discussion as well is there may be kind of epistemological advantages to certain lines of questioning. Some of them may have more psychological than epistemological value, or
Yes.
more rhetorical values. There may be different reasons for using different arguments potentially.
Yes.
Some more
I
psychological,
agree.
some more logical or epistemological. Now, the fact that other people hold different opinions about it doesn't necessarily prove that something is wrong, but it does
No,
seem to increase cognitive flexibility, for example.
exactly.
One thing it requires doing is putting yourself in the shoes of other people, which is also engaging your brain at a different level, again, contributing to some of the psychological benefits of cognitive flexibility. So that's one, the
That's right.
dissent one.
So
What
that's
else do we
one.
have?
Another one is the notion that things look different from different perspectives. Right? So you look at the same object, or you look at the same situation, or you look at the same impression from a different perspective, or different people look at it from different perspectives, and they come up with different descriptions, with different understandings, with different messages, right? So, but that could apply to anything. We go and watch the same movie, and we come up with very different opinions about what we watched and what the message was, or if there was a message, and so on and so forth, right? So that is another way to say, look, even when you yourself, not just other people, but you change position, you change point of view, you look at things, at the very same thing from a different perspective,
Yes.
you're going to look at it differently. You're going to be understanding it differently, right?
This is
So these
also
are two,
potentially quite important psychologically in therapy.
right,
Like, so for
right.
example, when somebody is in the grip of worry, they may view problems they're facing as catastrophic and unsolvable. But the next day, when their feelings have abated and they're a different physiological state, a different neurological state, maybe in a different environment, maybe in a different company,
Mm.
their natural way of appraising the situation might be significantly different. So, in different brain states, in different environments, we'll often perceive things or evaluate things in a crucially different way. That's quite significant psychologically as well, I would say. So, carry on. I just wanted to
Absolutely.
kind of
So
emphasize
that's
some of the
yeah,
parallels with
yeah,
what
yeah,
you've covered.
absolutely. I think this is a good exercise we're doing. So those are the first two. Now there's three more, which I group separately because they actually have an interesting interconnection from a point of view of epistemology. They're actually referred to separately as Agrippa's trilemma. Agrippa, again, is the guy that came up with this thing. We don't know, by the way, anything else about Agrippa, only that he came up with these things. We have no idea what else he did in
That's
life,
enough.
who it was. That's right. That's enough. That's good enough. So the Agrippa's trilemma is often presented in this way. So if I say this thing is true, let's say, I don't know, Saturn has rings. This is true. It's a thing. Then you can ask me, you can push back and say, well, I already know that this is actually the case, right? And Agrippa said, at the end of the day, there is only three ways, and only three ways in which I can respond. One is by say, well, because of this, and you say, well, but why that? And I say, well, because of this other thing, and then you keep going like that. And at some point, I'm going to stop you and say, look, this is the assumption. This is where we start. Okay, there's a fixed starting point. So there's an assumption. Or in the process of these questions of you keep asking why, and I keep asking answering because, at some point we get to a circularity issue. That is, I'm going to give you an answer that I actually already gave you before. So there is an issue of one of my answers is actually doing these circular job basically. So now we're running into a circle. We're not extending into on a line that ends at one point. We're just running in a circle. The third way I can stop this is not stopping it. That is, let it go ad infinitum. It's an infinite number of why, because. Now, none of these three is actually very satisfying, right? Because if you say a circular argument or an infinite regress or something that begins with a dogmatic assumption, none of these three are particularly satisfying. And yet those are, Agrippa argued, pretty much the only games in town. At some point, if you push things far enough, you will get into one of these three modes, as he called it. Now, modern epistemologists have put these taken this separately from the other two modes and called it Agrippa's trilemma, because it turns out there is now a theorem that shows that these really are, it's a mathematical theorem, that these are really the only three ways you can end any question of the kind, how do you know stuff? And that's a major insight. That's a major conclusion from somebody living 2000 years ago, that at the end of the day, human knowledge has limitations, and the limitation is that you either end up in an infinite regress or in a circular argument or in some kind of assumption that cannot be further questioned. And if you stop and think about that for a second, this applies to empirical questions, it applies to mathematical questions, it applies to logic. If you think about it for a second, I think it blows your mind, because it really says, whoa, I just learned something extraordinary here. And that was the result of thinking skeptically about human knowledge, the limits of human knowledge.
This is familiar territory in some ways in undergraduate philosophy, where I feel like all philosophers kind of go through skeptical phases of varying degrees. And you haven't mentioned, because we haven't had a chance yet, like Descartes, de omnibus dubitandum, everything has to be doubted. And also, the most important figure in the entire history of Western philosophy, David Hume, simply because he's Scottish. So very important in that regard.
He's one of my favorite philosophers, and he was definitely a skeptic. He wrote about a really interesting essay on skepticism, and he was influenced both by what we call Pyrrhonism and the academic skepticism. Yeah, David Hume is definitely one of the big ones.
Well, if you don't mind, let's get into some trickier questions about skepticism.
Yeah.
And I'll say from the outset, I don't know the answer to them, but they're kind of maybe the ones that we could chew over a little bit. So the first one actually would be, having said, in true skeptical fashion, I'm now going to kind of contradict myself. Having said that, I think skepticism has a lot of value, untapped value in terms of comparison with cognitive therapy. I want to raise the question whether it really is healthy. So you also, this is a thorny issue as well about the distinction between seeing something as probable and also acting on it and treating it as a fact or treating it as true. Because you mentioned earlier, for example, that the skeptics treat ataraxia as an important outcome or goal. But I mean, obviously, if you were, a cheeky student, you might say to the skeptics, "How do you guys know that your philosophy definitely leads to ataraxia? And perhaps more and fundamentally, how do you know that ataraxia is definitely a good thing?" So the skeptics are going to have to accommodate that a bit, but at the very least, and they probably can, but it's going to probably be at least a little bit uncomfortable for them because it plays such an important role in their philosophy. Now, having mentioned Hume, as an advocate of skepticism, he himself raises a problem for skepticism, I think. And I'll give you a little bit of history here. When I was at Aberdeen, we study David Hume, obviously, doing philosophy. He's a big figure. But we also study Scottish common sense realism, which was a school of philosophy that emerged in opposition to Hume. And its leading figure was an Aberdonian philosopher called Thomas Reid, right? And Thomas Reid particularly latched on to the fact that Hume, when he was describing skepticism, said that he found it impossible to maintain his skepticism outside of his study, in part because it caused him to feel depressed. And he also said that he found it impossible to maintain his skeptical views when he was playing backgammon and dining with his friends. So it's a little bit of a glib remark in some ways, but Thomas Reid really took that quite seriously and said there's something inherently wrong with this, because it's almost like Hume is saying, at least what he means by particular skeptical views only work in a theoretical context in academic philosophy, but they're not really workable. Now, I suppose a more serious way of framing that would be, do the skeptics set too high a standard for defining knowledge? And does it differ from how, for example, knowledge or certainty could be defined by ordinary language philosophers or how we employ those concepts in daily life. So let's start off, though, with the question of whether skepticism is actually healthy. Could there potentially be a downside to it?
Yeah, I think that those are all very good points. The first reaction I have is, however, many of the things you mentioned, for instance, the confidence that ataraxia is in fact a good thing, or that skepticism leads, suspension of judgment leads to ataraxia. Those are really things that affect much more the Pyrrhonists than the academic skeptics, because the academic skeptics didn't think that ataraxia was, the end of life. Remember, those were Platonists. So for them, the end of life is virtue. It's not really different from the Stoics.
Yeah.
So it does depend. We need to distinguish between the different streams of skepticism in that sense. But I want to go back to the very serious question of raised by the David Hume's example. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is that this may have just been David Hume, right? It may just have been his own personality that did that sort of stuff, right? We don't know. We need quantitative studies on a large sample. But if we do take it seriously, I think that what it tells us is that skepticism by itself cannot be a philosophy of life. That skepticism can be a very good integration or a very good addition or a spice or whatever you want to call it on a pre-existing philosophy of life, but not a philosophy of life in and of itself. Because you're right, it is hard, very, very hard to be consistently be a skeptic, and you risk depression if you're so inclined. But even if you're not so inclined, it is still very hard. That is why, however, I've been captivated by the figure of Cicero, because even though he claims to be a skeptic as a sort of philosophy of life, in fact, that is on the background of his Platonism and his attraction to Stoicism. So I think it's much safer to say that he is a Stoic with an addition of skepticism, right? So he's a Stoic that, however, reserved the right to disagree with the orthodox Stoics on this or that or the other, depending on what the situation is and depending on what the arguments are. That is one of the things that I try to push in the book. That is, skepticism is helpful as an addition to your own view of life, whatever that may be. I think one can be a skeptical Stoic, but one can also be a skeptical Epicurean or a skeptical something else. And it's a good addition because it reminds you that you could in fact be wrong. It's a practice of epistemic humility, essentially. It may be also having practical good positive effects like the one you were mentioning a few minutes ago of being more flexible in terms of your approach to things, and therefore less likely to get depressed or things like that. But yes, I would agree with David Hume, with Le Bon David, as he was called in French salons, that too much skepticism is not a good thing. It probably will cause serious damage.
Quite a simple therapeutic observation. So it's a bit glib from a philosophical point of view, but I think it has deeper resonance, which is it would be obvious to say that being skeptical or suspending judgment about unhealthy beliefs would potentially be therapeutic. It's less obvious that suspending judgment about seemingly healthy beliefs would be the best strategy to employ. So that would be the trickier challenge. But for sure, there's definitely like believing that nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I might as well go and eat worms. Like, it's definitely going to be worse
not
for
healthy.
me than suspending judgment about those kind of things. Or that losing my job is just unbearable and absolutely catastrophic. Like strong value judgments. Now, there's another kind of historical point, or point about the interpretation of philosophy. First of all, caveat, like, interpreting ancient philosophy is problematic. As you mentioned with Pyrrho, there's some gaps in our knowledge and mysteries about exactly what he meant by certain concepts. And these schools of philosophy evolve. I think it might be possible to say there are skeptical elements from a modern point of view, as you were implying, in Epicureanism and Stoicism as well. And over time, I think it might be fair to say that the skeptics and Stoics inevitably would have converged to some extent a bit more in their view, because they're arguing with each other. They're going to have to concede some ground. And over time, perhaps the views come somewhat closer together. So I want to try and kind of tease out what some of the differences might be. Again, I'm going to try and do that as bluntly as I can. Coming back to this issue of the standard of knowledge. So my understanding is that Carneades would think that the theoretical possibility that we might be mistaken would be enough to prevent us from ever being able to say with certainty that we know it's raining outside, even if we feel that we can clearly see that it is. So if I look outside and I see that it looks like it's raining right now, Carneades would want to say, well, like it strongly appears that it is, and it may be highly probable that it is, but it's still possible theoretically that you could be wrong. Therefore, you could
Mhm.
never truly say with certainty that it is raining outside. Would that be a fair characterization of his position? At least I think some skeptics would say that. Would Carneades say that? Or
Some
Cicero?
skeptics definitely, yeah, some skeptics would definitely say that. I think Carneades would say something similar to what you just said, but he would also insist that,
Mhm.
again, beliefs come with very different degrees of likelihood, so to speak. And
Right.
so if I actually look outside of the window
It's
and see
raining.
that there is, a lot of rain coming down,
Yeah.
and then I get out myself and
I could be
definitely
wrong,
it's,
Massimo.
some, it could still be
I
wrong. I
could be
could still be
dreaming.
wrong in theory. That's right. It could be dreaming. It could be hallucinating things. But
Yeah.
never, or there could be somebody. We're
Could be a
in
bus
Turin.
fight.
I'm in Turin here, so it's
Yeah.
Turin is the one of the movies capitals of Italy, and so it's possible that somebody's actually doing a movie out there and and
Yeah.
and making it look like it's
Possible.
raining, but it's not,
Theoretically
right?
possible.
But
Right.
not very likely, right?
Yeah.
Not very likely. And
But
so
would that
the
prevent
skeptics,
Carneades from saying that I know that it's raining outside?
it would. At some point, I think Cicero is special. I don't know about Carneades because, unfortunately, we don't have a lot
Yeah.
by him. But Cicero would say, "Look, at some point, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Your confidence is so high,
Yes.
right? That yes, sure, it's possible. There is a logical possibility that you could be wrong, but for all effective purposes, dude, take the umbrella and get out because it really is raining, right? So I think that skepticism, when not pushed to the extreme, does a lot of good work because it reminds us of the importance of epistemic humility, the fact
Okay.
that, especially in a modern society where we live in a highly polarized world where everybody's
Yeah.
absolutely sure about whatever the hell they're saying.
Yes.
That's
Yes. I
just
agree.
like slow down a little
We
bit.
could definitely do with more of that on Twitter, for example. Right.
Yes,
I I'm going to let. I just want to compare the view that I'm attributing, fairly or unfairly, to Carneades to
yes,
what I think the Stoics might say. Like, and maybe this highlights the extent to which I think over time they may have come to converge, and the differences might be difficult to interpret. I think the Stoics would say that if I looked outside and saw that it was raining, that we can legitimately say that we know it's raining outside, as long as I clearly see that it is, and this would be a crucial distinction, that there's no good reason to believe otherwise. Right. So I don't believe. I think it may be that Zeno perhaps said that there was a kind of inherent mark that
hmm
that made certain
yes, that's right.
impressions cataleptic. But I think over time the Stoics came closer to the view that we also need to be free from any countervailing reasons that might lead
Yeah,
us to believe that our sense impressions are false. And I think that's
that's right.
closer to the common sense realist view, which would be a look
Yeah,
in reality, in daily life, outside the study of my academia, like Hume is the contrast that Hume is making in a way. If I look outside and I see it's raining, unless I've got good reasons to question my senses, then I'm probably going
you
to
just go for it.
want to say
Yeah,
it's raining. And I probably
yes.
wouldn't say I look outside and it seems to me with a high degree of probability that it's raining. Like I'm more likely to say it's raining. Like I know
Right.
it is.
I think that's right, but it's interesting you use the word. It doesn't contradict anything else that we know. The one of the levels of pitanon that Carneades described, one of the highest levels, not
Yeah.
the highest, but one of the highest levels. He described it as undiverted. An
Mhm.
undiverted impression is exactly what you're
Yes.
talking about. Is an impression for which I have no reason to disbelieve it, right?
Yeah.
The only level that is higher than that in the Pitanon that Carneades proposes is what we will call he calls it a thoroughly investigated, and we will call it scientific knowledge.
Uh,
That's the highest possible. Not only you have no reason to disbelieve it, but you actually have a lot of very strong positive reasons to believe it, right? Again, at that point, whether you in the back of your mind say, sure, but I could still be hallucinating or not,
yeah.
it makes very little difference.
Isn't that what Zeno means by this hand gesture
Yes, by this,
that
that's right.
Cicero says he's describing? Then we have the
Yes,
cataleptic impression. So we have this clear, distinct, firm, robust impression, but it's also has to
yeah,
be integrated with knowledge, like a network of other beliefs, in order for us to be able to say that we actually know that it's the case. Okay, I've got some sort of quick fire questions for you. In
sure.
the spirit of undergrad philosophy, right, Massimo? Do you have two hands?
Yes, I do. It's an undiverted impression.
Yeah. So I use that example because G. Moore, if I remember rightly, going back a bit. Now, this is I'm really testing my recollection. So Moore was kind of influenced by common sense realism, and he wrote a book on
Yes,
certainty, which
yes,
Wittgenstein then I think disagreed with. So they're then really teasing out, what certainty is and how it compares to knowledge, and um,
right.
so I think Diogenes the Cynic and Epictetus and the other Stoics would say, yes, we have two hands. Pyrrho and Arcesilaus would say it might look like I have two hands, but we can never be absolutely certain. Is that fair? Like Carneades would say, I'm almost certain that I have two hands. It's highly, highly probable. Or would you think they?
I think it's slightly different. So I think that the
Right,
Pyrrhonists would say, look,
right,
yes, we do have two hands, but that's because having hands
yeah.
or observing your hands is one of those evident things that
Is
you
that the
really
same
have
as a
no reason,
cataleptic
right?
impression then? What's the
No,
difference?
it's not. It's not the same as a catalytic impression because everybody would agree. You don't need a sage to
Right.
conclude that you have two hands, right? So that it would be for a Pyrrhonist, that would be an example of something that is evident, and you don't really need to go into skeptical territory for that at all. Now, most of us would agree that yes, I do have two hands. However, as soon as I was saying that to you,
Uh-huh.
um, I was also remembering that, of course,
Right.
there are pathological cases where people
Yeah.
think that they have an arm, for instance, that they don't anymore. They feel that they have the arm, they feel they can move it, and so on and so forth. Those are the phantom limbs kind of thing, right? Which reminds you, of course, that's a pathology. I mean, that's there's something gone significantly wrong with your brain, but that is the point. The skeptic would say, "Sure, I have two hands. It's an undiverted impression." Unless, of course, I have one of those conditions, in which case I wouldn't know, would I? Um, so the question then becomes, do you have enough reason to take
But
seriously the
would
alternative?
Carneades say that I know that, or would he just say that it's highly probable?
You would say that it's highly probable. Yes, that's
Okay.
right. You would say it's undiverted. It's not the kind of thing that I need to worry about. Uh, but yes, there is a
Yeah.
possibility. There's as much as it is a small chance that I actually could be wrong even about that.
I think it's definitely fair to say that the Stoic and Cynic position, which is yes, I do have two hands, is going to be closer to folk psychology or folk
Yeah,
epistemology
I
than
I agree. Yes.
the Carneadian position, which sounds more like a definition that would apply in academic philosophy, like almost designed more for doing philosophy, but perhaps not. Well, let's come back. Let's shelf that and we'll come back to it in a minute. Just as a side note, if I remember rightly, and I could be wrong about this, I think what Moore and Wittgenstein disagreed about was
Hmm.
Moore said I could be certain that I have two hands, and Wittgenstein
Right.
wanted to say that that was a weird way of framing it, and the belief that I have two hands is more like something that I just take for granted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
I think that was Wittgenstein. Yeah, it sounds like a good rendition of Wittgenstein's thinking. Yeah, I tend to think that the reasonable thing to say there is, look, it doesn't make much of a difference, but if you push me,
Hmm.
I will say it looks like we have two hands. I have two hands. Not
Yeah.
that I'm absolutely certain, because there is always the possibility that we are dramatically wrong about something and don't realize it. Right?
Hmm.
Like this morning, friend. Let me give you just a very
Is that setting too
simple
high
example.
a bar for defining knowledge in everyday life, though? Like, should we distinguish between how we like define the
Well,
concept of knowledge in everyday
we
life?
do distinguish, right?
Yeah.
So long as we say, look, I understand that this is for all effective purposes, I'm going to act as if this was in fact knowledge with a capital K. I'm just keeping in the back of my mind that that's not a possibility, right? That
Right.
there is another possibility. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I don't think I cannot resist the notion that this is literally an academic exercise, right? I mean, we're talking about the academic skeptics, but
Yeah.
this notion is important because it is in fact the case that we know that our senses can be wrong, or our
Hmm.
reasoning abilities can be wrong, even under conditions where we are absolutely certain that they couldn't possibly be wrong.
Hmm.
Since there are a number of examples like that in the literature, then it stands to reason to say, look, yes, I'm very highly convinced of this thing, but there is a possibility.
I think there's a way we could dig into the nuance a little bit more that might be relevant to therapy. And I guess this might be a
Hmm.
distinction between a kind of descriptive versus a normative epistemological point.
Yeah.
So, and it comes back again to, I guess, to Hume's example and similar examples. Um, I wonder, and I don't for sure know the answer to this, but when I act on an impression or a belief, and a good example here would be Spirus and the pomegranate that he ate. So
Yes.
there's a famous anecdote of a Stoic philosopher who seems in some ways kind of leaning more, gravitating a bit more towards the skeptic view, who was tricked into eating a wax pomegranate, if I remember rightly.
Yes. That's
And so
right.
he was questioned about whether he had a cataleptic impression that it was a real pomegranate. And he responded by saying he responded to the belief that it was reasonable to assume it was a pomegranate, which is not the same as believing that it is a pomegranate. Right. Now,
Right. That sounds like a skeptic.
the descriptive point I would make is that is it really possible in ordinary life to consistently act upon the basis of assumptions without effectively treating them as if they're just true rather than probably true? If we pick an example, I mean, in some cases it might be, but if I pick up a pomegranate and eat it, am I acting as if it's probably a pomegranate, or am I behaving as if it is a pomegranate that I'm eating? I think it
Right.
becomes kind of hard to tease out the difference at that point, honestly.
It is hard to tease the difference. I think you're right. But the example of Spheres is actually interesting. I never thought of him as a potential leaning towards skepticism, but
Quasi
it sounds
skeptic.
like it. Yeah,
But
yeah,
I
it
think
does. It does.
Hume, incidentally, I'm assuming Hume would say no. Like Hume would say, I have to just believe it's a real pomegranate once I start eating it. Like, I have to set my
I would
skepticism
say,
aside in order to
right.
he says
From
he talks about dining with his friends. He can't
Yeah,
maintain
that's
his
right.
skepticism, for example.
No, he cannot. He can suspend judge. He can suspend his own skepticism basically and say, "Look, yes, it is possible in theory that this is not real wine, not a real fruit, and so on and so forth. But tonight, I'm going to reject that and just eat and play backgammon and eat and drink as
And
if, right?
behave as if it's
Um,
real. Yeah.
exactly. Behave as if it's real, and I think that's pretty healthy thing to do. But I also would think that it's is healthy to remember that I am in fact suspending my skepticism in this case. I am saying I'm going provisionally with something that I
Yeah.
can revise at any moment, just like Spheros did, right? When he actually bit into the pomegranate that was turned out to be made of wax, he said, "Whoa, hold on a second. As it turns out, I was wrong."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There was a mistake that I made somewhere.
I've got a couple of quick fire questions for you then to build on
Sure.
that theme. All right. Is losing your hand catastrophic? And what would let's try and imagine what these different philosophers might say about that.
Yeah. No, I would
Epictetus
say,
would say no.
yeah. Right. No, it would say no. That's right. It's a setback, but it's not catastrophic.
It's highly dispreferred, he would
That's
say.
right. It's highly
What, what,
dispreferred.
what would the skeptics say, though, about having your hand chopped off?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that depends on what kind of skeptics you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
A Ciceronian skeptic would say the same thing that Epictetus says. Look, this doesn't affect your virtue, and so it's not a catastrophe. It's a setback. You'll figure out some way around it. The Pyrrhonist would say, well, this is a thing. It happened, and so long as it doesn't get too much into your ataraxia, then you're going to be fine. Right? So, yeah, I think that it depends. The answer for the skeptics will depend on what kind of skeptic one is, Pyrrhonist versus academic, and also if you are an academic skeptic, what kind of philosophy of life you lean toward.
Would some of the skeptics, would Carneades, for example, say it's probably not catastrophic, but it theoretically might be?
That's a good question. I don't think so, because that's not a statement of fact. That's a statement
Okay.
about how I react to things, right? So it might say, you have your hand, you very likely have your hand, that sort of stuff. It's an undiverted impression. But once you lose your hand, whether it is a catastrophe or not, that depends on your values, not on a factual matter.
I've got another quick fire question for you. Okay, like a related one then. Is virtue good according to these different philosophies?
Right. So Epictetus, of course,
Epictetus
would
would
say
say yes.
yes. Right.
He's easy.
Clearly.
He's easy.
He's an easy one. That's right. I think Cicero does say yes, but as a skeptic, he is bound to say very likely. It is, I think yeah, very probably, right? So he would say that this is that conclusion, that virtue is the highest good, is not only undiverted, but it's actually thoroughly explored. That is, it's the highest possible degree of confidence that you can have. And that's why you act on it, because, you're staking your entire life on it, right? If you accept that belief, then you're acting for the rest of your life in a certain way. So you better not be wrong about it. And so he would say, yes, that is the kind of impression that requires the highest possible degree of confidence that you can possibly have. But he would have to admit, if he's a good skeptic, that he could be wrong even about that. Yes.
So if virtue includes wisdom,
Yep.
and so that would mean the wisdom is highly likely to be good and choice-worthy and desirable, but theoretically it
Yes.
might not be. Does
Yep.
that mean that skepticism itself as a philosophy might not be beneficial theoretically?
Yeah. Of
According
course.
to skeptics, they think it's
If you're talking about
probably a good
beneficial,
philosophy, but it might not be.
right? If a consistent skeptic would have to say something on those lines, right? Now, when one makes the additional step, however, to say, look, this is not just my epistemology, but my philosophy of life, and therefore this is good for me to be, it's good for my well-being to act in a certain way. That becomes an empirical question, and therefore, yeah, you're definitely supposed to be skeptical about it.
At the point at which it becomes your philosophy of life and you're acting consistently in accord with it, doesn't that bring us back into the territory of treating it as if it's categorically true rather than merely a matter of probability? So if it becomes like what Wittgenstein, almost like what Wittgenstein called a way of life, like if this is actually my philosophy of life and it's how I see the world and I'm consistently acting in accord with it, am I not going to have to treat it more like an assumption rather than a highly likely hypothesis?
You might treat it as an assumption, but that doesn't get you out of trouble, because even assumptions, of course, can be questioned, right? And so
In
you
the
could say,
study,
look,
I guess in terms of reflecting on it in the context of doing philosophy, but in terms of actually living my day-to-day life, I'd maybe have to suspend my questioning in order to consistently
yeah.
values.
I mean, you mentioned Descartes before, right? So even Descartes, who famously engaged in this radical exercise of radical skepticism, right? He said, okay, imagine that there's this evil demon who is fooling me on all sorts of things. And, what do I do at that point? Where can I start to sort of rebuild my knowledge of the world.
Yeah.
Even he says you don't want to do this on a regular basis, right? You want to do it maybe once or twice in your life, but not
Just
on a
as an
regular
aside,
basis.
like another traditional counter argument against some of the skeptical arguments would be the skeptical argument requires making assumptions that are less plausible than the assumptions that it's attempting to refute. So the evil genie in Descartes, I think, is a really good example of that. Like
Yeah.
the Stoics would probably say, but there's no reason to believe that there is an evil genie. Like it's an extreme, like highly unlikely, implausible argument, but it's also far less plausible than the assumption that your senses are simply accurate.
Yeah, although I think Descartes fairly would say, well, you're kind of begging the question there, because it's not like Descartes says that he believes in the genius, in the evil genius, right? He says it's a thought experiment. So he says,
Yeah,
even if there was such a thing, I'm not claiming that there is such a thing, but even if I had that degree of uncertainty about things, is there something that I can use as a building block? And of course, as you know, his answer is yes. The fact that I'm a thinking being, I might not know what kind of thinking being I am. I don't
yeah,
know necessarily whether I have hands or not, but I know that I'm thinking, right? Because it's not possible. It's logically not possible to have something that is thinking and not actually be a something that is doing the thinking. So I yes, if somebody took Descartes' thought experiment as an actual statement about how the world works, that would definitely be wildly implausible, right? But if you take it for what as it is meant to be, that is an exercise in once in a lifetime exercise in radical epistemology, then it's a different thing. Also, we need to be clear here. Descartes was neither an academic skeptic nor a Pyrrhonist,
yeah.
as it turns out, right? So he was engaging in
Methodological
that kind of
skepticism, like
yeah, right, exactly. He was engaging in that exercise for different kinds of reasons. He wanted to essentially, in a sense, he wanted to find a way out of Agrippa's trilemma. He wanted to find a building block that could, in fact, be used as the starting point for rebuilding knowledge.
gosh, we should probably wrap up in a minute. We've gone a little bit over time, so I don't want to keep you too long. Well, but we could go on forever. There's definitely rabbit holes, like
Yes,
in
one after
skepticism.
another.
Yeah, but I just wanted to kind of like bring up some alternative viewpoints, partly to defend Stoicism a little bit,
Yes.
but also from a clinical point of view, a kind of therapeutic point of view, we might wonder whether a different standard of knowledge or certainty might have psychological benefits in daily
Hmm.
life. You know, so I can imagine arguing in a therapeutic context for a different standard of knowledge or certainty than I
Right.
might in a philosophy seminar. That seems a bit contradictory, but there are different considerations in those two different contexts, and at least taking account of those would be worthwhile. And then maybe and that might be a part of the argument between the Stoics and the Skeptics. And, maybe the Skeptics are prioritizing a different type of discourse in a way. The
Hmm.
Stoics are maybe more interested in certainly the Cynics are definitely more interested in a type of discourse that's about self-improvement and ethics
Yes, that's
than they
certainly fair.
are
But
interested in.
frankly, I think that the Stoics got themselves into some degree of unnecessary trouble at that level because,
Yeah.
and again, this is for people who are interested in getting in detail in this. John Sellers goes into it in some detail, the discussion between the skeptics and the Stoics. But I think the Stoics at some point got themselves into a little bit of unnecessary trouble by invoking this notion of the sage, right?
Yeah.
Which in fact the later Stoics hardly refer to. I mean, Seneca does write a book on the sage, on the
Mm.
wise person, but Epictetus doesn't mention him at all, and Marcus Aurelius, I think, neither. So the question that got the Stoics into trouble is, why do you need in terms of your philosophy of life to postulate that there is some kind of perfect human reasoner that is always going to get the impressions, correct? Why do you need to
Mhm.
go that far? Why don't you just say, look, we're doing our best. Yes, I could be wrong about my judgments about impressions. Epictetus, I think, doesn't need that. He can say, he always says, trying to come up with the best judgment about your impressions. He doesn't say that you need a perfection. In fact, interestingly, now that I think about it, one of the Stoics who was skeptical, so to speak, of the sage was Panaetius, the guy that inspired Cicero to write on duties, right? Because Panaetius, apparently, the story goes, in fact, I think this story is in fact told by Cicero, that one of Panaetius' students at some point says, "Oh, so what do you think the sage would do under these circumstances?" And Panaetius looked at him and said, "Look, as for the sage, I don't know, but
Right.
since you and I are not sages, let's try to figure out what we do with our impressions." So we really don't need the figure of the sage. It does kind of the work of a almost, although it's not
Uh-huh.
intended to be, but it's almost a supernatural being. It's almost like the Jesus of the
Yeah.
Christians. It's like this really, really high level, ideal person that's like, we don't need it.
Some of the schools of philosophy did claim that their founders were sages, or that their founders were
Epicurus, for
confessing.
instance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Pythagoras would be like an even more
Yeah.
extreme example.
Pythagoras also. Yes, that's right.
Um,
That's right.
and the Stoics were renowned for refusing to do that. Like they
Exactly.
insisted that Zeno was fallible. Like he
Exactly.
wasn't perfectly wise. I actually, there's one thing I wanted to mention that I've kind of forgotten to mention. So that might be a good place just to wrap up neatly. We went all the way back to Socrates, but there's also, at least the skeptics claimed, rightly or wrongly, they might be kind of stretching things a little bit here, that skepticism goes all the way back to the Delphic maxims, the
Right.
Temple of Apollo. So the most famous
Right.
Delphic maxim is "Know thyself," and then the second most famous is "Made an agan," or like nothing in excess, which already sounds potentially
Right.
like it might be relevant to the skeptics.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
third one that no one ever quotes, because it's tricky to translate, says surety is near to ruin, or making a
Mm-hmm.
pledge is near to
Mm-hmm.
ruin. And Plutarch says, if I remember rightly, the skeptics interpreted that as meaning that overconfidence or certainty, like making a pledge or a promise, like swearing that you believe something, like predicts ruin or is close to ruin.
Right.
So they thought
Because
there
you
was
could
this
be wrong.
ancient tradition,
Because you could be wrong.
yeah,
Yes. That's right.
that a
And
lot of
and
problems in
Plutarch would
human
know.
life are caused by overcertainty. Yeah,
Exactly. And Plutarch will know since he was a priest at Delphi, so he had a
yeah,
pretty
yeah.
good knowledge of that kind of. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable interpretation. Actually, both the second and the third Delphic
And
sayings
those
might be
maxims might be
interpreted certainly.
related. So if you're
Yeah,
a skeptic, you might think, okay, yeah, like skepticism is about self-knowledge, and it's kind of about avoiding excess, and it's kind of also about the idea that overconfidence might be ruinous or harmful if you're not
that's right.
careful.
That's right.
Like so, okay,
So
well,
it
let's
goes all
wrap
the
up.
way back to
It
Apollo.
goes all the way back to the gods invented everything. Like Apollo invented everything. So what's the book called? It's called How to Be a Happy Stoic, not like the miserable David Humean
That's right.
Scottish Stoic, like a dour Stoic, but a happy Stoic. Um, is it out already, Massimo, or is it? I've
It's out
got a
tomorrow. It really comes out tomorrow.
sneaky
Yeah.
copy. It
Yeah.
comes out tomorrow. Rush out and buy a copy with a high degree of probability. Like,
Exactly.
yeah. And thank you for your time once again, Massimo. There will be a recording of this available, which we'll be sending out on Substack, and I'll put it out on my podcast as well. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks once again, Massimo, for telling us all about skepticism and Cicero.
Thanks, Don. It was a pleasure.
Till soon. Bye bye, everyone.